It was an autumn morning when the doors of Charles de Gaulle Airport opened to reveal a group of soldiers returning from a delicate mission in Chad. Operation Barkhane had been a military success, a strategic victory against the jihadist groups that threatened the Sahel region, but for some of the men and women who participated in it, it had left deep and invisible scars. Wounds that couldn't be healed with bandages or words of comfort. Among these soldiers was Marc Dufresne, a 42-year-old veteran, returning after several months in the Sahel Desert, a place where the heat, dust, and fighting seemed endless. The wind of return was not that of victory, the one expected after a successful mission, but that of the weight of memories, images, and noises which clung to him like a second skin. As Marc and his comrades walked through the large reception hall of the airport, an atmosphere of solemnity invaded the space. The air was heavy with respect, but also with palpable tension, as if each soldier was a piece of living history, a witness to events unfolding in corners of the world where peace seemed so fragile. A small procession of journalists, photographers, and dignitaries gathered to welcome the soldiers, paying tribute to them for their courage and commitment. Among the personalities present was President Emmanuel Macron, who made the trip to greet the men and women of the Barkhane mission in person. This symbolic meeting, beyond the official ceremony, was to mark a turning point in the recognition of the sacrifice of French soldiers in Africa. But if the welcome was marked by polite smiles and gestures of recognition, it was also marked by a heavy silence. Some soldiers seemed exhausted, almost detached, as if the war had left them in a state of profound weariness. Their eyes had lost their shine. Their bodies bore marks of fatigue that even applause could not soothe. Another soldier passed by, then another, and the ceremonial gestures were repeated, but none seemed to really understand what was going on behind the mask of the uniforms. And then, when Marc appeared, a strange alchemy occurred. President Macron, standing among the officials, scrutinized the faces of the soldiers who paraded before him, each with their own story, their own ghosts. And suddenly he stopped. He didn't move, his gaze fixed on Marc. A flash of recognition crossed his eyes. Not that of a head of state who honors his soldiers, but that of a man who, in the eyes of others, recognizes a brother in suffering. A man he had seen in photos, perhaps mentioned in confidential reports, but that was not what caught the president's attention. He was not the accomplished soldier, nor the medal. He was the man behind the soldier, the man who carried within him traces of war, visible and invisible. Marc was not a soldier like the others. He had been a key figure in the Barkhane mission, a field officer, a man capable of making decisions in extreme conditions, under pressure, in uncertainty. But what the president saw was not just a soldier who had participated in an important mission. What he saw was a man scarred by war. His face was marked by scars, some deep, others more superficial, but all testifying to the violence he had suffered. Shards of metal, shards of shattered lives, fighting in the desert heat and dust. Marc had taken bullets, grenade fragments, and perhaps worst of all, pieces of his own mind that had shattered in contact with war. His eyes, once lively and piercing, had lost their shine. It was not only the weight of the years that tarnished them, but the inner pain, the pain that settles in the eyes when we have seen too much, felt too much, suffered too much. His pupils were as if darkened by an unfathomable depth, a void that never seemed to be filled. Marc had seen his comrades fall. He had walked on poisonous ground. He had lived in permanent uncertainty, fear, and anger. But what he carried within him was also a silent burden. He had brought home, beyond the memories, ghosts that he could no longer erase. His step, although proud, seemed heavy, as if he were carrying an invisible but inevitable burden. Every movement, every gesture was an attempt to face what could not be said, what could not be shown. Marc wasn't just tired, he was exhausted, broken in a way that evaded words. President Macron then stepped forward, his approach quick and confident, but once in front of Marc, he slowed down. He stopped just a few feet away, an emotional silence settling in the space between them. Rather than offering the ceremonial handshake he intended to give to all veterans, he stopped, deeply affected by the intensity of the situation. He held out his hand, But it wasn't just a polite gesture. It was not a formality that he performed out of duty, but a true act of gratitude. There was a sincerity in his eyes, an understanding that went beyond words, as if, in that precise moment, he saw beyond the soldier, he saw the man. Their eyes met. Mark's gaze was hard, tired, but it was no longer that of a fighter. Not that day. It was the look of a man who had seen and experienced things he could never speak of a man who had lost a part of his soul in this desert. The president's gaze was imbued with deep empathy, an almost tangible weight. They looked at each other for a moment that seemed suspended in time, a moment where looks spoke to each other without words, where pain, sacrifice, and recognition mingled in mutual understanding. Around them, the ambient noise of the cameras, the murmurs of the journalists, dissipated like a distant mist. Everything seemed to fade, as if, in that moment, only the look of the two men mattered. The other soldiers, too, were silent, respectful, some staring at the scene attentively, as if they too understood that something bigger than a simple ceremony was taking place. Mark, on the one hand, didn't know how to react. He was used to honors, handshakes, congratulations in public, but this gesture from the president was not like the others. It was not overplayed, nor dictated by the necessity of the occasion. It was a gesture full of respect, understanding, and perhaps also the beginning of repair for years of forgetting and silence. Mark felt a slight shiver run down his spine, not from fear, but from an emotion that he had not had time to let emerge. The war had left him speechless, and this simple gesture from the president seemed to say to him, "I see you." Then, in a whisper, Emmanuel Macron spoke. His voice was firm, but full of gravity, each word measured, each syllable marked with an almost solemn weight. "Mark, I'm not giving you another hug. You gave your life for France, and yet you have not received the recognition you deserve. This must change, and it starts now." These words, simple but heavy with meaning, resonated in the air like a promise. These were not empty words. It was the silent commitment of a man who, at the top of the state, recognized the suffering of his people, of those who had fought and suffered, often invisible, often ignored. It was no longer a question of simple formulas or political speeches. It was about truth, of recognition, repair. The stunned journalists stood there, wide-eyed, their cameras trained on them. The silence thickens further, as if the president's words had suspended the air. The moment seemed unreal, timeless. Everyone's attention was fixed on the stage, as if the whole world, for a moment, stood still to listen to what was coming next. Emmanuel Macron, in a gesture imbued with authority, raised his hand and signaled silence. In an instant, everything stopped. Even the sounds of the cameras were muffled, as if the president had imposed absolute calm, a serenity that contrasted with the palpable tension that reigned in the room. There were no more whispers, no more footsteps on the cold airport floor. The world seemed suspended, attentive to every word, to every gesture. Macron then turned to the audience, where several veterans were standing, observing this historic scene. Each of them seemed more deeply touched than the last, their eyes shining with suppressed emotion. The president took a deep breath, as if preparing to face history, and in a louder, more resolute voice, he declared, "You who came back, injured or not, were left behind. Too often, promises of support and help have been empty words. It will be over." A shudder ran through the room. It was a rare moment, a speech of incredible power, where the president did not just say what everyone expected, but went beyond, by breaking a taboo, by giving a voice to those who had too often been invisible. The faces of the veterans, who until then had borne their wounds in silence, turned towards him. There was a silent recognition in their eyes, but also a form of relief, as if what they had waited for years had finally been said loud and clear. The president, with his words, gave them back a place in society, gave them back a part of their humanity. Macron continued, his voice strengthening, carried by a surge of conviction. "It is time to correct this oversight. The country owes you more than applause. You deserve to live with dignity, and that dignity starts today." In the room, we felt that the president's words touched the heart of things. The silence, already heavy, seemed to become even denser. There was, among the veterans, a form of shy recognition, as if, finally, their sacrifices were heard, as if the country was waking up to grant them what they had always sought: dignity and respect. The president had announced a silent revolution, a change that would affect lives, repair years of disappointment. This moment was not just an official ceremony. It was an act of justice. And then, in a gesture that shocked everyone, Emmanuel Macron took an envelope from his pocket. It was not a predictable move. We could have imagined that he would give a speech, or that he would give a medal, but no. He pulled out a carefully folded envelope with a pristine white surface. A red seal, that of the presidency, was affixed to it with almost ceremonial precision. The envelope seemed to be the symbol of a serious decision, of an official commitment. Macron then turned to Mark, who was standing there, almost frozen, his eyes glued to the envelope. The president handed it to him slowly, and Mark took it hesitantly, as if he had difficulty grasping the significance of what was happening. His fingers trembled slightly, not in fear, but in astonishment, as if the reality of what had just happened was still making its way into his mind. The war had often brought him face to face with the unexpected, but he would never have imagined a scene like this, such a moment of recognition. He opened the envelope slowly, almost automatically, his eyes scanning the contents with a certain disbelief. Inside, he discovered a check. But it wasn't just any check. It was not a symbolic gesture, like decorations or commemorative plaques. No, this check was personal. It was signed by the hand of the President of the Republic, a check which carried a sum of money that Mark would never have imagined. A sum that exceeded anything he would have dared to hope for from his country. It was much more than just a financial settlement. It was an act of symbolic importance that went far beyond the value of money. It was a concrete sign, a gesture of apology and recognition. It was recognition that the state, finally, saw its soldiers and offered them not only a form of reparation but also full recognition of their sacrifices. Mark remained there, suspended for a moment. He couldn't understand what had just happened. This check, with its amount larger than anything he could have imagined, represented much more than numbers. It was a sign of oblivion which was finally dissipating. He looked at it, his fingers still trembling. For a moment, he thought it was just a dream in which humanity, recognition, and dignity were finally returned to those who had lost them by giving everything for their country. He looked up, searching for the words to express what he felt, but they didn't come. The moment was too big, too heavy with meaning. He never imagined that one day he would be seen like this, recognized and, for the first time, repaired. The president also announced that the government would immediately launch a national rehabilitation program for veterans, an ambitious program aimed at providing concrete solutions to veterans who had long been left behind. This program, he said, would include funding for tailor-made medical and psychological care, adapted to the physical and mental trauma that soldiers had suffered during their missions. Veterans would have access to specialized treatments, regular follow-ups, and therapies to help them overcome the invisible wounds of war. These measures went beyond simple emergency assistance, encompassing a long-term vision for their reintegration into society. He also promised the creation of an independent commission made up of public health experts, psychologists, and veterans themselves to assess the living conditions of veterans. This commission would be responsible for verifying that these men and women receive not only symbolic recognition, but real concrete support. Transparency would be key, and the recommendations of this commission would be implemented without delay. The president insisted that these were not empty promises, but a firm commitment, a structured plan so that, in the long term, veterans will never again be ignored or neglected. But what shocked the most was his last sentence. He stopped for a moment, his eyes scanning the assembly, before speaking again in a serious and determined tone. I am not here to make a nice speech, but to right an injustice. We must return to you what you have sacrificed. And from now on. The silence that followed his words was heavy, as if the entire air had been suspended. The audience remained frozen. The weight of these words resonated much louder than anything else in his speech. It was not a simple call to action, but a solemn promise, a recognition of the national debt towards these men and women who had given their bodies and minds to the service of France. Some veterans, dulled by years of silence and incomprehension, began to cry discreetly, their faces marked by years of suffering. It was as if, in this solemn gesture, part of their pain dissipated. But beside them, others, more skeptical, murmured among themselves. Some looked on suspiciously, wondering if this moment, as moving as it was simply a well-orchestrated political operation. Promises have been coming for years, without ever really coming to fruition. These veterans had learned to be wary of speeches, to doubt symbolic gestures which, in their eyes, had often been followed by few tangible results. Yet what everyone could see was that Mark, the veteran, had just received recognition that few had dared to offer him. It wasn't just a promise. It wasn't just another hug. The president recognized him, and all the veterans present, not only as war heroes, but also as forgotten citizens. This gesture marked a turning point, and, although some remained doubtful, there was a palpable conviction in the air. Perhaps this time, words would be followed by actions. Mark, still in a whirlwind of emotions, clutched the check in his hand, as if he had trouble believing it was real. He looked at the president, who didn't look away, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of hope rise within him. A promise, certainly, but a promise which, if kept, could transform the reality of many veterans who, like him, had long been forgotten. The cameras clicked, and the journalists, who had observed the scene with new attention, began to discuss. Their own skepticism about what had just happened perhaps diminished a little by the president's apparent sincerity. But deep down, one of the big challenges remained whether these words would really be translated into action, and whether this movement would be a start or a simple reaction to public pressure. The veterans began to stand up, their posture straighter, as if this moment, although painful, had given them a little pride. Mark, at first frozen, finally turned to his comrades. He saw in their eyes something he hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would immediately be perfect, but the hope that finally, something would change. President Macron, at his side, remained silent for a few moments. He knew that his words were only the beginning, that they must be followed by concrete measures. But he had, perhaps for the first time, laid the foundations for a change he hoped would last. Mark was not alone. Not this time. In the days that followed, the media went wild. News channels, newspapers, and websites fought over the interpretation of the event which had shaken public opinion. Journalists were speculating about the real intentions behind Macron's gesture. Was it a sincere humanitarian gesture, a desire to repair a historical injustice, or was it just a clever communications maneuver to improve the president's image, particularly in Africa, where the issue of veterans was particularly sensitive? Political analysts wondered about the scope of this decision. Would it really result in lasting reforms, or was it just a media stunt intended to appease a segment of public opinion before an election? Future? Social media was flooded with heated debate, with each side expressing their views with fervor. On the one hand, thousands of internet users welcomed Macron's gesture, believing that finally, a president recognized the value and sacrifice of veterans, long forgotten by society. On the other hand, critical voices underlined the legitimacy of the questions that were being asked. Would a symbolic gesture be enough to repair years of neglect, or had the veterans still, basically, been used as instruments of electoral strategy? Hashtags such as hashtag reconnaissance veterans and hashtag Macron pour les soldats invaded news feeds, while others denounced the use of human suffering for political purposes. Regardless, a change seemed to have begun, although its depth and duration remained uncertain. For the first time in a long time, veterans, long left in the shadows, were finally in the spotlight. Politicians and citizens began to hear their stories, to become aware of their suffering, often invisible, but omnipresent. Was this sudden attention going to translate into concrete actions? The future would tell, but a dynamic was already underway. Mark returned home, the letter and check still in hand. The door to his apartment closed behind him, and a heavy silence engulfed him. He placed the envelope on the living room table, his hands still trembling from the emotion he had just experienced. He sat in his chair, his gaze blank, lost in thought. He didn't know if this gesture would repair all the wounds left by the war, if the physical and psychological scars would one day fade. Neither the check nor the public recognition could erase the images of his comrades fallen on the ground, nor the sleepless nights haunted by the echoes of the explosions. But he knew one thing. He had finally been seen. Mark leaned back, closing his eyes for a few moments, breathing deeply. In the hours that followed, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. He felt a form of relief, but also a sense of incomprehension. Why now? Why hadn't we acted sooner? Was war always a price to pay to receive the recognition of a people? He thought of his comrades, of those he had left behind in Chad, of those who had not had the chance to return, of those who were still fighting against invisible demons, even after their return. He also thought of those who, like him, had lost their family, their friends, a part of themselves during the missions. Was it a fair price? An acceptable price? These questions haunted him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a little less alone in his pain. The phone vibrated on the table, breaking the silence. It was a message from his childhood friend, Francois, another veteran who had served with him. He had seen Macron's speech on television, and his message was simple. "Did you see that, Mark? It's good, right? Finally someone who sees us." Mark gave a bitter smile. He replied briefly, "It's a start." He took the letter again and looked at it. It wasn't just a piece of paper, nor a check. It was a symbolic act, a turning point. For him, this represented a recognition that he had never thought possible, a legitimacy that he had not dared to hope for. And even if this gesture didn't change everything, it gave him, for the first time in years, a feeling of dignity. He didn't know if the country would go further than this speech and this check. But at this precise moment, Mark felt a little more at peace with himself. He had finally been seen, no longer as a simple soldier, but as a man. That, for him, was worth more than anything. This was perhaps the greatest gift the war had given him: recognition.